Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. In our series about the history of revolutionary ideas, we have reached the French Revolution, and we're going to be doing 3 episodes about 3 of the key figures of that revolution. Coming up, Thomas Paine, Maximilien Robespierre, but first, someone who's probably not as well known today, but does have some claims to be the person who started the whole thing. I'm talking to the historian Lucia Rubinelli about Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, better known sometimes as the Abbé Sieyès, and he's the man who came up with the ideas that got the ball rolling. How did an obscure clerical politician, a bishop's secretary, invent the idea of the French Revolution? A word of apology, we had a tiny bit of trouble with Lucia's mic, so there's a bit of interference. Please don't let that put you off what is a fascinating conversation. Lucia, we should probably start by talking about the man himself, because I'm guessing for a lot of people he's not a familiar historical figure, though he's a very important figure in the history of revolutionary ideas. He was born in 1748, which I happen to notice is the same year that Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher, was born. And weirdly, like Bentham, he lived an awfully long time. So actually he lived to be 88, which is kind of a miracle when you think about, and as people will hear, what he lived through. It's just a miracle he survived it. And like Bentham, he spent quite a lot of his life designing and writing constitutions. Weirdly, Bentham is known as a utilitarian, but actually probably in his own mind, both these men thought what their main job was trying to think of constitutions for the new states of Europe. One big difference between Sieyès and someone like Bentham is Sieyès was a priest. So he's usually known as the Abbé Sieyès. I think we probably better start by explaining what kind of priest he was, because he wasn't what you might call a conventional religious figure.
He mostly went into religious education because he was born out of a pretty modest family in the south of France. He was not the first born in the family. And so it was pretty standard to send him off to religious school just to get him out of the way. And he was a talented student, so there was a career path for him. So after having studied with the Jesuits in the south of France, he went to this extremely prestigious institution called Saint-Sulpice in Paris, where he was trained to become an abbé, where he studied theology. He even has a degree in theology from the Sorbonne. He became an abbé, but he never really became a priest, in fact. He was never ordained a priest. He would never say mass. He would never actually take part in the most ritualistic and ceremonial aspect of religious life. His life inside the church was the life of an administrator, basically.
So in a way, actually, he wasn't a priest. He was a kind of politician of the church.
Or a high bureaucrat.
And he didn't like what he saw. I mean, so what he got was a kind of education in Ancien Régime, pre-revolutionary French politics from the perspective of the church and the privileges of the church, because this was, we're going to come on to this was the age in which to exercise politics through the church was to basically make use of privilege. And he was appalled. Is that fair to say? I mean, insofar as his education gave him a revolutionary temperament, it was in part, I mean, he also read widely in the age of the Enlightenment, but it was in part because he saw the ways in which political life in France was conditioned by privilege.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. At the same time, one should also stress, of course, we do not know exactly what his religious attitudes were. Everything seems to suggest that he was not a committed Catholic or Christian. So not only his entryway into religious life was through politics and administration, but also he was not committed to the value that the institution was meant to uphold. So he had this kind of unusually double perspective on what the role of the church was in France that led him, I think, have a peculiarly cunning eye on what was going on at the time. So he lived most of his early life in total obscurity. I mean, yes, he had a decent career within church institutions, but he was not particularly remarkable or known. He became suddenly very famous in the summer of 1788 and then in early 1789 when he published 3 extremely inflammatory pamphlets on the question of the reunion of the States General.
So that's the event that changed his life. It changed French history. It changed European history. We can be as hyperbolic as we want about this. It changed world history because this is the initiating event of the French Revolution, the decision by the King, Louis XVI, to summon this thing, this representative body called the Estates General. And it is Sieyès' take on what that meant and what possibilities that threw up, which really did change the course of French history. Not obviously on his own, it wasn't just him, but my God, he made an impact. We probably need to try and make sense of the context. And so in a way, the obvious question is, what was this thing, the Estates General? More to the point, why did Louis XVI summon it? Because I think the key fact about it is that it hadn't been summoned, is it since 1614 in France? And I was trying to do the math, so that's 175 years roughly. So it would be like some institution being summoned now to solve our political impasse that had last sat in 1850. So this is an institution of which not only does no one have a memory, but no one knows anyone who knew anyone who has a memory of it. It's an institution from so far back in time that to recreate it is to do something which opens up all sorts of rival interpretations of what the thing is. So why did Louis XVI summon it? Why do you think you needed this thing that hadn't been needed for 175 years?
Well, I mean, to put it shortly, because he was about to go bankrupt. The Kingdom of France had been having financial trouble for quite some time at that point. But the scale of these financial troubles and the scale of the debt that had accumulated had reached such a level. They were in an impasse. They had no clue on how to finance this debt. And that at the time had a different meaning than it does have now. Today is not that scary. States operate with massive debts, whereas at the time, that was not the case. So there was an impasse. The king tried for years, in fact, to negotiate a way of getting out of the situation with the Parlement de Paris, which is a kind of consultative institution that represented mostly the aristocrats. They were trying to find a way out of the problem, and they failed repeatedly. All sorts of available institutions were tested and tried, and no solution came out of all this testing and trying. So they were in a logjam, really. And the king decided to take this rabbit out of the hat and summon this very old institution that, as you say, nobody had a clue on how it worked. And really, it was designed for a different society. I mean, French society had changed pretty radically in the past 170-something years. So that raised a lot of questions on how this would work. And there were moments in which the negotiations seemed to go in one direction, then they took a different turn. And by the summer of 1788, it looked like the way in which this would work is that society would be, or civil society would be asked to choose representatives to be sent to the Estates General according to their belonging to one of the three orders. So the idea of the States General is that it's the general reunion of the three estates that make up French civil society. The first is the clergy, the second is the aristocracy, and the third is the third estate, which didn't even have a name. It was just the third estate, but it really added up to everybody else, or the commoners. And the assumption here was that each estate would sit in this reunion of the Estates General with the same number of representatives. Representatives is not the right word, as we will discuss later. It's delegates. So they would have the same number for each estate, even though, of course, the aristocracy and the clergy was much smaller in terms of population than the third estate. And what really bothered Sieyès is that whatever decisions they had to make would be made by counting votes per estate, not per head, which basically meant that the first and the second estate would always vote together and overrule the third estate.
And this, in the context of the central question, which is how to fund, it's the king's debt. As you said, it's not like now. One of the reasons it's not like now is because of the American and French revolutions. But before that period, the problem for the king is it was, in a way, it was his personal debt, and he could go bankrupt. And he had to raise money from someone somehow to service this debt. And there was a limit to the ways in which he could get taxation agreed to do this. And he couldn't really expropriate it. He could try. The challenge was to raise this revenue. And everyone knew in a way that the revenue raising part of these estates general, these three estates, was the third estate. The third estate represented the productive part of French society. Yes, the church had a lot of wealth. Yes, the aristocrats had a lot of wealth. But part of the problem is that the king had sort of reached the limits of trying to extract wealth from those two. The third estate was the one which had probably within it the capacity to service these debts. But what it looked like was the first two estates were going to use their numerical superiority in this system to put the obligations on the third estate. So part of the challenge here was not only was the third estate liable to be outvoted because it was numerically superior but not in this system, but also it was liable to be basically exploited by the system.
And without any sense that it could consent to that, which I think is really what bothered Sieyès. It's not so much that that would be serviced by the third estate, which was kind of the only way out. And Sieyès was pretty realistic about it. He knew that the only solution to the problem of the king's debt was for the third estate to pay taxes, basically. But he thought that if it had to do so, at least it had to consent. And not just consent, but the price that the king and the Ancien Regime had to pay for it was a complete overturn of the structure of political authority in France. In other words, if the third estate is to service the debt, is to shoulder the burden of saving France from bankruptcy, then the third estate had to be the sovereign.
These pamphlets that he wrote, the most celebrated of them was called, helpfully, self-explanatorily, What is the Third Estate? So, as you said, these were arguments about how is this thing going to work? People could see what the goal was. It was to secure some kind of consensual arrangement that prevented the French state from going bankrupt. But it was very hard to see how to achieve it. And one of the questions was how to understand the relationship between the different parts of the Estates General. So the question for Sieyès, he wants to answer in the most famous of the pamphlets, is what is the third estate? And his answer, it's one of those sort of openings to a political document, which maybe when I read it out now, tell people how he began the argument, it won't be entirely clear just how incendiary it was. But it is one of the rallying cries of revolutionary thought that kind of knocks the rest of them out of the park. What he said was 3 questions. What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been hitherto in the political order? Nothing. What does it desire to be? Something. So what is it? Everything. What has it been? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something. And what makes it so radical, so incendiary, is that the third answer, which he knows is the one that most people are aspiring to, by implication is completely inadequate because the first answer is correct. And what makes it revolutionary, and I think the reason it is revolutionary in the way of maybe now better known revolutionary documents, the Communist Manifesto, pretty much all the writings of Lenin, is that it is completely uncompromising. So he knows that most people recognize the injustice of this arrangement. The third estate is much more numerous in the people it represents. It is the productive part of French society. He called the other two estates basically parasitic. This is the productive part. So this is where the wealth is generated. This is where the wealth that is needed to rescue the French state will come from. The people who represent this part of French society are going to be outvoted because they have no status here, because they are simply going to be outnumbered. So what they want is more. You know, they want to be recognized. They want to have big concessions made. They want reform, the classic reformer idea, something. We're sick of being nothing. We want to be something. And he says, but you're everything. That sort of started the French Revolution, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think the truly revolutionary part of the beginning of that pamphlet is really the first sentence. I mean, what is the third estate? Everything. Because the rest, sure, they all knew, as you said, right? They all knew that it had been nothing up to then. And they had to become something if they wanted to use it to service the debt. But I think the revolutionary implications of the pamphlet really come from the idea that he believes that the third estate is everything. It's not just something, right? It is everything. And this is, I think, yes, at its core, this is the revolutionary purchase of the pamphlet, because what it then goes on to argue is that what makes up a nation is its productive part. So it's the members of the nation who produce wealth that add up to the nation. And he goes as far as to say that the clergy and the aristocracy not being productive is not part of the nation. They're, as you said, just parasites of the nation. So when he says the third estate is everything. It's not just an inflammatory expression or metaphor. It is actually a claim of political economy. I mean, it is those who produce are those who have the power to speak in name of the nation. So if you're not producing, and that basically he's telling the aristocracy and the clergy, the first and second estate, then you have no right to decide anything for the nation, on behalf of the nation, which I think is truly a radical revolutionary statement at this point.
And it's one of those rare radical revolutionary statements that quite quickly produced the effects that it desired, in the sense that this pamphlet was widely read, I believe, very widely discussed. It was popular. It was a bestseller. He was obscure, but he suddenly became famous, properly famous. And the argument posed a question for the first estate and the second estate, which is, what are you going to do? And if there's even a possibility that the third estate is going to be everything, then you better join with them. You'd better collapse the Estates General into a single assembly, because he's more or less saying the Estates General doesn't exist. There's no general set of estates that have come together. There's just one estate, and that is now the representative body of France. And members of the first and second estate, I think particularly of the first estate, did basically start to defect, didn't they?
Yes. So his proposal, then again in the rest of the pamphlet, but also one should add that this pamphlet came out in January 1789, but then he was a member of the Third Estate in Versailles in May 1789. So he not only wrote the pamphlet that started the revolution, he also was there arguing for it and effectively turning the reunion of the States General into a National Assembly. So he wrote the theory and then put it into practice. And the pamphlet goes on to say what the Third Estate wants when he says it wants something. That something amounts to three demands. The first is that the members of the Third Estate, or the delegates of the Third Estate at the Estates General, needs to be actual members of the Third Estate. So you cannot have a clergyman from the higher clergy or an aristocrat represent the Third Estate. You need members of the Third Estate.
Even though he himself was.
Yes, but here the thing is complicated, because who counts as a member of the first estate within the clergy was up for grabs, in the sense that if you were a lower level, lower rank clergyman, you were still a third estate. I'm sorry. You still need to have some sort of wealth. Again, as Sieyès would put it, right? You cannot earn your life. You have to live off rent. So the clergy that composed the first estate was just the members of the clergy who were wealthy enough not to have to work, basically. And Sieyès was not one of them. So he was effectively a member of the third estate.
Yeah, and he worked for them like he worked for a bishop. I mean, that was his job, wasn't it?
Yeah, he had a salary, a monthly salary, probably a weekly salary back then. But the second demand that he thought the third estate had to advance was that the third estate had to have as many representatives as the sum of the representatives of the first and second estate. And it was a matter of fairness to the proportions as they were reflected in society. So the third estate is, of course, the vast majority of the population. And so it cannot have the same number of representatives as the first and second estate separately. It's only a fair representation of society if their numbers add up to the sum of the numbers of the representatives of the first and second estate. And then the third demand, which is the very important one, is that votes would be counted per head and not per order, which is really what when he takes his seat at the reunion of the Estates General in May, this is the real point that he's trying to enforce, and that really starts off the revolution. Because, and that's his theory, if you vote per head and not per order, then the division of the reunion of the Estates General into orders dissolves. And essentially, the reunion of the Estates General transforms itself into a different body, which is what he calls the National Assembly.
So in a way, the uncompromising thing here is that he sees quite quickly, there's a version of being something which is the sort of compromise version, but he's making demands which will, I think he believes, get you quite quickly from something to everything, doesn't he? Because the rhetoric around this is actually there is no compromise to be made. It's not as if a just society would be one in which the producers have an equal number of votes to the parasites. It doesn't make sense. The parasites shouldn't really have any votes, which is what he's saying. It's everything. There are certain kinds of somethings that are the sort of typical negotiated version of French politics that French politics had struggled with and failed to get beyond, concessions and trade-offs and this and that. This is a version of that where actually, if you go so far down this road, you will be on a slope which takes you all the way. And it did. I mean, it's just incredible how quickly it did. The Estates General did become, in a matter of months, a single constituent assembly.
Yeah, I mean, it became a national assembly immediately almost, right? Because as soon as the proceedings started, he took the floor and said, well, my pamphlet is well known. What am I going to say is that either the other two estates join in and stop voting by order and instead vote as single, private citizens, as individuals, which would really amount to dissolving the political significance of the division of society into orders, or we, the third estate, take off, go into a different room, and establish the National Assembly, which is what they did. So they went full on radical. And then in the matter of a few days, members of the first and second estate defected and joined the National Assembly. So this is one of those rare cases in which somebody lays out the theory and it actually plays out exactly as he meant it to play out in practice.
What did he think then that assembly was? So it's not like it's turned itself into something like a legislature or a parliament. It is an assembly whose job is to constitute a new set of arrangements for French politics. So that is, it's a constituent assembly. Its job is to come up with a new constitution, right? And that's not the same as being a lawmaking body in the conventional sense.
Well, so yes, here it's where waters got a little bit muddled. Sieyès' theory, as first spelled out in one of the other two pamphlets, Views on the Executive Means, but then he also kind of retells a version of the same story in What is the Third Estate, was that if the third estate, or let's use his language now, if the nation is to service the king's debt, then the nation should sit in the National Assembly, decide to suspend all tax payments. So people would stop paying taxes until a constitution is approved. And then it would service the debt. So it's kind of a blackmail to the king of sorts. So we are going to service the debt only if you let us have a constitution. But what is truly revolutionary here is that he is not just asking the king to approve a constitution or to give a constitution. He is saying we should write the constitution and we approve the constitution. So what his demands really add up to is everything, is we are going to service the debt. But the implication of that is that sovereignty passes from the hands of the king to the third estate, to the nation.
And one of the things that I still find it hard to wrap my head around is what becomes sovereign here is the body whose job it is to draw up the constitution. This is the constituting body that has assumed sovereignty in the name of the nation. It is the body that will decide the political shape of this nation. But it will then need to delegate, through the terms of this constitution, all of the traditional functions of politics, judicial, executive, legislative, and so on, so that he's created a body which is now sovereign, but it has a very specific function, which is to draw up a constitution. I mean, it depends whether you think drawing up a constitution is or isn't a limited function, because in a way, in the terms of his pamphlet, it's everything. Drawing up a constitution is everything. But that's its job. It is a constitution-making body that is sovereign. And after, if it gets a successful constitution, then all sorts of other bodies will come into being that also speak for the nation and actually do the business of politics. Is that right? Is that how it was meant to go?
Yes, but I think there's a missing step here, which is that what he is really saying is that the nation is sovereign, not the National Assembly. The National Assembly is simply the representative of the sovereign nation. So sovereignty, or using the language he preferred, the constituent power, belongs to the nation. So the source of authority is with the nation, which means the third estate, means the productive part of society. And one should say here, I mean, there are different ways of interpreting this passage in Sieyès, but I think that what he's saying here is not that the members of the clergy or the aristocrats cannot be represented in the nation, but that they can only as long as they are willing to divest themselves from their privileges, as in the social recognition of their privileges and the political consequences of that privilege, and just be a member of the nation like any other member of the nation. So here he expands the scope of the nation to include all French citizens, as long as they act only as citizens and not as members of a specific order. and they become sovereign. So political authority lies with them. And what they do is that they elect to a National Assembly their representatives who are tasked with writing the constitution. Now, things here get complicated because he had this very neat theory, but in fact, of course, the representatives were already sitting in the National Assembly when they took off from the reunion of the States General and established the National Assembly. So there wouldn't be a new round of elections to a new National Assembly. Sieyès tried to argue as much as he could for a new round of elections to a constituent assembly that would be different from the National Assembly. So he wanted to separate the two and leave the National Assembly with the task of ordinary legislation until a constitution came into force. And instead, he wanted a constituent assembly to be directly authorized by the citizens to write a constitution. Now, this didn't happen in practice. It was way too complicated, way too cumbersome. So although he tried to push for it till the very end, at the end, what was decided was that the National Assembly would have within itself both functions, the legislative function and the constituent function. They created a committee for the constitution that was really tasked with drafting the constitution that was then approved by the National Assembly.
And what was the conception of representation that he thought would be operating here? So in the non-ideal version, it's this body that has been elected for another purpose, actually originally to be the third estate of the Estates General. Then it's morphed into a National Assembly. Now it's morphed into a National Assembly, which is also a constituent assembly. But what did he think in the ideal version would be the relationship between the people who elected representatives to this assembly and the kinds of decisions they make? Would they try and make decisions that they thought their electors wanted them to make? Was it a delegate model, or were they then given a free hand to interpret the needs of the nation according to what they discussed in their assembly?
Sieyès was absolutely in favor. I mean, he had a very sophisticated theory of representation that perhaps we can discuss in a moment, but to just answer the question, he believed that representatives had to be completely free from mandates. In the summer of 1789 and early fall of 1789, there is a pretty wide-ranging debate within the National Assembly over whether representatives should consider themselves bound to mandates or not. And Sieyès speaks very eloquently against this idea. And really, the fact that representatives should not be bound to mandates for Sieyès boils down to what he thinks is the character of modern politics. In modern politics, in modern states, in modern societies, representation cannot rely on mandates. And the reason for that is because he believed that representation was not simply political representation, but representation was a fact of modern society and could be found anywhere in all aspects of our lives, both political lives and personal social lives. Representation went as deep as to explain how we go about buying bread. He believed that in a modern society, families do not bake their own bread because they are busy producing, they're busy doing their things. And so they delegate the task of baking bread to the baker. And so the baker is a representative of any given family because he's doing something for them that they've asked him to do.
But he's not doing it according to their instructions. He's not baking the bread because they've told him how to bake the bread.
Yes and no. When it comes to social representation, in fact, he makes more space for some instructions. So just to give you an example he always uses is this idea that in a society where, in modern society organized according to the principle of the division of labor, you do not, if you want to say something to a friend who lives in Bordeaux and you are in Paris, you do not go to Bordeaux, you send a letter. But in the letter, you write instructions to the postman, right? You tell them where to go. Then, of course, the postman doesn't write the letter, though.
Nor does the postman take your instructions about how to get there.
No, exactly. And that goes back to the idea of the division of labor, right? Which is really what informs his understanding of the presence of representation in all aspects of life, which is that in modern complex societies, production, broadly meant, is specialized. And so it requires special skills to bake bread, to send letters, or to do politics. And so part of the point of representation is that in order to have things done efficiently, done well, done in a competent manner, you need to trust the person who's doing that on your behalf. And why do you trust them? Because they are the experts in the field. That's the point of the division of labor. You have the baker bake your bread because he's an expert. He's going to have the good flour. He can have some sort of economies of scale. He's going to be more efficient. And this really the same principle applies to politics. So citizens elect representatives to act on their behalf, and they elect them with a free mandate because they trust them that they're going to make the best decisions out of their expertise in politics. So politics becomes a job, like any other job, like being a baker or being a postman. It's a job because it relies on a form of expertise that cannot be substituted by the mere will of the citizen.
And Sieyès thought that he himself was an expert in constitution making. He studied it, he devoted a lot of time to it. I think we probably need to sort of distinguish two ways of thinking about what's revolutionary about this. So the thing that you have described, the revolutionary moment, and as you said, actually, I'd said it's months, but the key thing is days. There is an enormous shift in power from the king, the royal court, the king's ministers, to this new body, which has asserted its right to speak for the nation. The new constitution will not be a grant from the king. It will not come down from the king. It will be given to the king. I mean, the direction of travel has been turned 180 degrees. But then there's the question of what will actually be in this constitution. That's a separate question. So the means by which this constitution will be delivered, something revolutionary has happened. And the king is now in a completely different position. But that still leaves open the question, what kind of constitution will France get? And you can have more or less revolutionary constitutions in the sense they can be more radical, they can empower different kinds of representatives. What was Sieyès' ideal constitution? So having done the revolutionary thing, how revolutionary was he in what he wanted to be the new constitutional basis of French politics?
Yeah, not as much as one may expect, given the first few lines of his pamphlet. So one should also say, I think, that Sieyès, as much as he was a political theorist, he was a politician. And by this, what I mean is that he was very sensitive to shifts in political moods and to the opportunities that the circumstances opened or foreclosed. So it is really hard to figure out exactly what his ideal constitution looked like, because he was a pragmatic actor. So he was working with what was there, with what was available. For the first constitution, which is the one he was pretty involved in drafting, he was adamant, but at that point, most people were, that the king should remain king. So France should remain a monarchical state in the sense that the head of state should be king, but with a legislative assembly. One thing that remained consistent over all of Sieyès' constitutional projects is that the assembly had to be unicameral. So he was adamantly against bicameralism. And part of the way in which he explained his opposition to bicameralism was in opposition to the English constitution, which at the time was being seen as this example of stability and success. And instead, he called it monument of Gothic superstition. These are his words. And the reason why that was the case is because he believed that bicameralism somehow underscored a system of orders.
So the House of Lords, the second of the two chambers in the British Constitution, was exactly what he had been objecting to in arguing that the third estate is everything. So there isn't a clerical chamber in the British Constitution, but there is an aristocratic chamber that includes the bishops, because there's a state church, so the two are in one. But the House of Lords at this point had real veto power, didn't it?
Exactly, it did. But he was against bicameralism in general because he thought that there always was a risk of the second chamber representing some sort of special interests in society. So even in relation to the American Constitution, he had doubts over the Senate and the fact that the membership to the Senate could transform into effectively a privilege order, or the representatives of a privilege order. So that's something that remained consistent over time. And one should say, he wrote many constitutional projects. He was kind of compulsively writing constitutional projects. There is a very funny description of Sieyès in one of Edmund Burke's, the famous Anglo-Irish conservative writer, one of his writings. In one of his writings, he describes Sieyès as having a large pigeonhole filled with constitutional projects, some of which are sparkling, some of which are pretty sad, some are flowery, some have bird nests in them. I mean, he has all sorts of very weird descriptions of how Sieyès' constitution looked like, which I think goes to underscore not just how compulsive he was in writing constitutions, but also how he was willing to go with political opportunities, as I mentioned. But throughout all of these different types of constitutions, another thing that remains consistent is the idea that the constitutional system needed to culminate in some sort of point, like the top of a pyramid, that was unitary and that had to represent the unity of the nation. So in the first constitutional project, that would have been the monarch. In later constitutional projects, after the king's head had been chopped off, that would become the great elector. But he still believed that constitutions had to provide for a head of state that could represent the unity of the French nation, which would otherwise be impossible, he thought, to see if you didn't have this kind of pyramidal-shaped constitution.
But that head of state was primarily symbolic, not executive, in the sense of one of the things, as I understand it, he consistently objected to, again, in contrast to the American system, was there being any residual veto, either royal veto or subsequently executive veto. That the single chamber legislative assembly it wasn't all powerful, but it had far greater powers than its American equivalent, certainly than the House of Representatives. But the symbolism that was required of a single head of state was because, I guess he believed, that a legislative assembly was also bound to be a bit chaotic, right? Even though it has all the power, what it doesn't have is a consistent single voice, because there will be real politics in it. So it's a slightly odd arrangement in that, to start with at least, it has a king, unlike the American Republic, which is going to be a republic. And we talked to Eric Nelson about this in our last episodes. But the weird thing about the American Republic is it gives its non-king executive pretty kingly powers, including the veto power. This king is a figurehead. I mean, that literally is what he is, isn't it? A figurehead.
Yes, it is. On this point, it's interesting. Sieyès had an exchange with Thomas Paine over the meaning of a republic. So Paine reacts to Sieyès' arguments in favor of having a monarchical head of state by saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought you were in favor of the republic. Why do you want a king at the top of the system? And so he accuses him of being monarchical, and Paine takes the defense of the republic. And what Sieyès responds in that exchange is basically to say that they mean the same thing, in the sense that what constitutes a republic is not who symbolically represents the unity of the nation, but is the fact that the legislative power is representative. And then Sieyès goes on to say whether that power is then symbolically embodied in an assembly or in a monarch or in a great elector, which kind of Sieyès' language for a president, doesn't really matter. But this also goes to show exactly your point, meaning that for him, the monarch or the great elector was nothing but a symbolic representation of a representative system. So it didn't have effectively executive power, it only had symbolic power. And so his answer to Paine, again, is to say a republic without a monarch or a great elector is like a pyramid with the top chopped off, whereas his system is a pyramid that goes up till the top. But both are republics because both are representative.
In this constitution where the legislature has the bulk of the power, again, presumably he didn't believe that that legislature was one that should assume it had a mandate from the people to do what the people wanted. It would be elected, and presumably one of his objections to the US Senate at this point is that, among other things, it was unelected. So this is an elected parliament, which is the central decision-making body of the nation. It makes laws and it takes the key decisions about the execution of those laws, or it decides how to delegate those responsibilities. But what was its relationship to the French people in Sieyès' mind? It represented all of them, men and women, rich and poor, voters and non-voters? Or was it more answerable to the people who were allowed to vote than to the people who weren't? So it's a roundabout way of saying, in our terms, how democratic was it?
Well, first of all, he couldn't care less for democracy. In fact, he thought democracy was a swear word.
Right. So not democratic.
No, I think he would be happy for it. He would take it as a compliment. Sieyès had a very complex understanding of the relationship between active and passive citizens. So he would absolutely be in favor of some sort of franchise. Over time, he changes his plans as to exactly how to establish the limits of the franchise. But yes, definitely, he's not in favor of universal suffrage. He thinks that there are some citizens who have the competence to vote and some citizens who do not have the competence to vote. But even so, he still believed that the Legislative Assembly would represent the nation, the entirety of the nation.
And is that partly because the citizens who have the competence to vote kind of represent the citizens who don't? It's like a chain of representation all the way up.
Yes, two things to be said here. One is because of how his version of the electoral system would have worked, because it was not applied. But the idea was that there would be tiered elections that would start from the most basic local level. And these elections would be, the franchise would be more expansive than national elections. So people would vote their local representative. Then there would be other elections for the provincial representative, and fewer people would take part in those elections. Then the regional elections, in which only a small number of inhabitants of the provinces would take part in, and so on until the national election. So it's kind of a system of filtration, really, of interests, of public opinion, and of representation that starts from a relatively large base for these lower level elections for which the stakes are not super high, and then becomes less and less inclusive. So in one sense, yes, there is an idea that this process of filtering the selection of representatives has a representative character baked into the system itself. But part of the reason why he believed that a National Assembly elected with limited suffrage was representative of the nation is because he strongly objected to the idea that representatives are accountable to their constituencies. He thought that once elected, representatives are accountable to the nation as a whole. So going back to what we were saying earlier, there is no imperative mandate. There is no one-on-one relationship to the constituency. The representative is not there to serve their constituency. It's there to serve the nation.
Is another difference with the American model that it's also more centralized in the sense that what you described was it moves up from the local level to the provincial level to the national level, but it moves all the way up. It's not like at a certain point, in the American case, at the state level, a lot of the power just stays there and then some of it goes up to the federal level. It kind of all goes up to the federal level and then it comes back down again, in that it has to be delegated back down to more provincial levels. He had a pretty centralized conception of what it meant to govern a nation like France.
So that's the other big difference between Sieyès and most, in fact, French theorists at the time and the American case, because it was anathema to most French thinkers to think of federalism as an option for France. France had to stay unitary. And so there was almost an obsession with the idea of the unity of France. And one of the, especially during the Jacobin terror, one of the worst accusations that could be raised against a member of the National Assembly or the Convention was to say that they were federalists. If you were accused of being federalists, you better watch out for your life, because this was really, it almost amounted to treason.
But federalist here meaning you believed in a nation which would be governed in a decentralized way. I mean, it's confusing because federalist in America came to mean the centralizers, but we'll just park that. But here it means you believe in a unitary state, not a state where real power lies in the provinces.
Exactly. So the idea that power had to be centralized at the center because France had to be a nation, as a unified nation. So Sieyès really insists on the importance of the unity of the nation, representation of the nation, not of its parts, or at least not at the higher level of legislation.
So we have been describing the early parts of what people tend to think of as the French Revolution. And most people, when they think of the revolution, if they have an image that comes to mind, it's later. It's closer to the more radical, but also the more violent parts of the revolution. So part of what's so extraordinary about Sieyès' story is that he's a survivor. When he was asked, what did you do in the terror? He said 2 words, I survived. But he was there until the really dark days of the terror. He was still there, sort of pushing his projects. What did he think of this revolution that he had helped to unleash? I mean, he'd been instrumental in this thing getting off the ground. What did he think as it became more and more radical and also more and more violent?
He thought it was a huge failure and he was terrified by it. And some of his early biographers think that, in fact, when he answered, I survived to the terror, what it meant is that, in fact, he fled. And apparently he hid somewhere in the south of France where his relatives lived, because otherwise he was afraid of ending up like Condorcet. And in that sense, he was not as brave a politician as, for example, Condorcet was. He did not really stand up until the very end for what he believed in. He was more of an opportunist.
Well, he stood up for it at the very beginning and at the very end, just not in the middle.
He did at the very beginning, exactly. But then when his life was in danger, he was happy to just flee. But having said that, when he came back and he started reflecting on what went wrong and what happened during the terror, one of the most interesting explanations he came up with was the idea that the revolution got hijacked by the prevalence of the notion of sovereignty, which he thought was conceptually and politically problematic because it could not distinguish between the bearer of power, so the nation, the people, and those who exercise power. The idea of sovereignty, in his opinion, comes with a pretense to have power and exercise it, which for him described very well what Robespierre was up to. Robespierre used the language of popular sovereignty extensively, and he thought that that language explained his obsession with the idea of being the voice of the people, of exercising power directly for the people.
In a way, Robespierre was the nation in his own mind.
Yes, he was. And that's interesting. Robespierre wouldn't use the language of the nation as much as Sieyès did. He would prefer the language of the peuple, partly because his basis was the common people, but partly because he did not believe in this idea of an abstract nation. He wanted the common people to have power. And this is what scared Sieyès. And Sieyès never used the language of the people. He used the language of the nation because the nation is an abstract entity. It's an abstraction of the diversity and complexity of individual wills into a political object that, however, cannot have a voice of itself. Nobody can convincingly claim to be the nation, right?
So when you put it like that, it sounds a bit like a philosophy that is not usually thought of as revolutionary, which is from a century and a bit earlier, Thomas Hobbes. But the idea that the real sovereignty, if we're going to use that word, if it's going to reside in something like a people, resides in an entity that cannot speak for itself. The danger is if you believe that the people can speak for themselves. But if you're clear that the people can't speak for themselves, so you can put the fount of power in that thing, but it's never going to be able to abuse you or oppress you because it can't actually act. So it's this weird kind of theory in which the basis of political power lies in something that cannot exercise political power and has to have it exercised for it. And that's your security.
I think Sieyès is very much Hobbesian, whereas one could say, simplifying a little bit, that Robespierre is Rousseauian. So here you have the two models, the two ways of thinking about popular power that clash with each other. Sieyès says it's less revolutionary, if you want to use that language, although at the time in 1789 it was very revolutionary, but it's less radical. And it's the idea that citizens authorize the exercise of power, but they do not exercise it themselves. And then at the same time, the constituted powers, those who exercise power on a daily basis, do not have the totality of power because they've been authorized by somebody else. And this is a difference from Hobbes. Hobbes wouldn't allow for that limitation of the power of the sovereign. On the other hand, you have Robespierre, who's somebody who drew a lot from Rousseau. Whether he understood him well or not, it's open for debate. But what he took, or he thought he was taking from Rousseau, was the idea that the people should make their own legislation. And so his attempt at changing the path of the revolution could be read as an attempt at giving the people the opportunity to have a more active role in writing their own legislation. Then, of course, that was all wrong. But you can read this phase of the revolution as an opposition between a certain version of Hobbesianism and a certain version of Rousseau.
In Sieyès' mind, it went very badly wrong. I think a lot of people thought it went very badly wrong. But that phase ended too, and Sieyès came back and he got involved again eventually in the highest levels of French politics, including notoriously at the beginning of the era, which would be the era of Napoleonic rule. Did he think there's still a lot of his life to go? He's going to live through a whole series of things, a whole turning of the wheel of the Napoleonic era, the restoration of the monarchy, and on and on. So he died in 1836. So we've still got a long way to go if we're in 1794. Did he think it got back on track at any point? He's sometimes described as the person who began the revolution and the person who ended it. And the reason he ended it is because he sort of opened the door to Napoleon taking this whole thing over. I mean, you could see a sort of Hobbesian irony here. France ends up with a single ruler who takes all the power of the people onto himself. But Sieyès was there. He was one of the people who effectively signed off on this, although he then felt betrayed by it. How did he understand what had happened afterwards? Did he think once it had gone off track, there was no getting it back? Or did he think that in the end, France became closer to the kind of state that he had envisaged in 1789 at any point in his lifetime?
Yeah, I think after the terror, when he came back and he was elected to the executive directory, he saw the opportunity of bringing France back on track. And that's why he opened the door to Napoleon, right? So what he thought is that the directory as a system was not working. It needed a new constitution yet again. And yet again, he was the man to do that.
He opened his drawers and he found, oh, I've got one, just the one you're looking for.
Exactly, there's one that's suitable for the times, but I need a man to make the coup, to make it possible. And he actually tries and tests a few generals, and none of them works. And then, there is this guy, this Napoleon Bonaparte, who's coming back, and he seems like a good guy. And so he basically asks him to stage the coup, which succeeded. And then he goes to him with the constitution. And the constitution was meant to create a consulate of 3 consuls, himself, Sieyès, Bonaparte, and a guy called Ducos, who wasn't particularly well known. And he presents it to Napoleon. Napoleon seems to be okay with it for a while. And then Napoleon concentrates all the power, the executive power, in his own hands and establishes the empire. So I think this epilogue to Sieyès' life as a constitution maker is kind of sad, but it is also telling of the risks of doing politics or trying to apply theory to politics. And here he was perhaps a little ingenuous or naive in thinking that he could just summon a general with an army and have him stage a coup and then give him a constitution and that he would follow through. That did not happen. But these were the delusions of the theorists trying to shape politics, I guess.
Because with hindsight, but it feels like not just with hindsight, it seems so at odds with one of the cornerstones of his theory, which is the idea that the head of the state is a figurehead and the real business of politics happens in the assembly. So in 1789, the thing that exists is an assembly, and he works very hard and very successfully to turn it into a constituent assembly as well as a national assembly, and then hopes that it will create a constitution which will empower future assemblies, but also create this sort of pyramid structure with a figurehead at the top. But the means that he uses 10 years later is to empower the figurehead. And it kind of feels like that's never going to work in his version of constitutional politics, because where is the third estate? Never mind what is the third estate, where is the third estate?
I think by that point, he has grown more wary of the third estate itself, in the sense that he realizes that the third estate is not just the productive bourgeoisie, but it is also the Parisian proletariat, for example. And so the concept itself, I think he kind of abandons it completely by then.
So he no longer thinks the third estate is everything. That's a dangerous idea now, is it?
It is, exactly. It is a dangerous idea. What he thinks is everything now is the nation. But the nation needs representation in a unitary figure. And so that's where the slippage, I think, comes in. And yes, the idea is, of course, to keep the rebels outside of politics, which is what he wanted to do from the beginning. That's his theory of representation, is that people do not take active part in politics. They are represented. And I guess the idea of the consulate was his last attempt at representing the unity of the nation, but it failed on his own terms.
So would you say in the end the Sieyès project was a failure?
I think in the short term, it probably was. And the irony of it is that Napoleon made him senator. So yes, that I would count as a failure on his own premises, right, on his own terms. But then, of course, I think in the longer term, it's a success. The revolution he started inaugurated a way of thinking and doing politics that we're still living with today. I mean, he was not the only one. It's not just thanks to Sieyès, and it's not just thanks to the French Revolution. But he certainly played a major role in shaping how we think about politics, and especially constitutional politics today. I think his influence is mostly felt in the success of his idea of constituent power and the distinction between a constituent power and a constituted order that is still structured constitutional theory today.
A reminder that we have a new bonus episode out now on PPF Plus. If you would like to hear it, just click on the link in the show description, sign up through our website, ppfideas.com. It goes with the last 2 episodes about the American Revolution, but this one is me talking about why some people today seriously think that Donald Trump is the living, breathing king that America needs. Here's a clip. The American case is different in other ways too. It is, after all, an argument about kings, which in the British case it isn't. We still have a king, they don't. So we frame it through the language of presidency and anxieties about presidential politics. They frame it through the language of kings and anxieties about kingly politics. Another huge difference in the American case is a lot of this turns on Catholicism. Vermeulen is a recent convert to the Catholic Church. J.D. Vance is a recent convert to the Catholic Church. The Supreme Court now contains, depending on where you draw the line, 5 or 6 Catholic justices. On this podcast, I have talked a number of times to Gary Gerstle about the enormous transformation in American politics that means that Catholic-inspired thinking is so central to the the language of the Republic and arguments about how to interpret the American Constitution, including in the Supreme Court. What would have been impossible, politically toxic, the idea that you draw on the Church of Rome to make sense of the American founding, is now not toxic. This is one of the ways in which the history reaches further back to the world of princes, back earlier than that to the early church. There is almost a year's worth of bonus episodes, that is 23 and counting, available now as soon as you sign up to PPF Plus. So to hear that and all of the others, just join now. We think you'll enjoy it and we really appreciate the support. Coming up next time on our History of Revolutionary Ideas, it is the man who is often associated with the French Revolution, the face of the revolution, including of the terror. We're going to be talking about Robespierre. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.